Hello students, today we are going to try and understand the institution of family and with a specific emphasis on trying to understand changes in the family. We're going to look at the various theorizations on the family, and then we're going to try and understand some of the changes that have taken place in the Indian family and also look at some of the global trends in family forms. Now, what is the family? Family is a universal social institution that comprises of a group of people related by ancestry, marriage or adoption who care for their offsprings and each other and share economic resources. An elementary family consists of parents and children. Families are based on structures of kinship, so families generally comprise blood relatives and relatives through marriage, and in modern societies, families have become differentiated from political and economic sphere. So if earlier families performed a range of economic functions and political functions, today families are fundamentally associated with the private domain of modern life. The onset of modernity has actually led to a kind of disintegration of large extended families where you had many generations and both blood and marital relatives living together and sharing residence. Today, what has happened is that there is a nuclearization of the family, which generally means that you have families which comprise parents and their biological or adopted children, and that is the general norm in modern societies. Now, due to industrialization, families have also shed their productive functions, which is they are no longer units of production, but they become fundamental units of consumption. Now, what has also happened is that family members have migrated due to wage work, and this has also created division within large household units and eventual nuclearization of the family. So, modern societies have been associated generally with smaller families. Now, for functionalists, they try to understand family in terms of the important functions that they perform to maintain social order. Some of the important functions that family perform is that they regulate biological reproduction, they regulate adult sexuality, they provide for the socialization of children, which means they inculcate the norms and values which are necessary for proper functioning of the society. Children learn them in families through primary socialization, and they also perform some important welfare activities such as care of the elderly and the sick, and particularly in states which are not very welfareist, this becomes very important, which is the caring activities of the family. Families thereby play a very important role in maintaining social solidarity. Functionalists tend to believe that whenever there is a situation of rapid change, it immediately affects the structure of the family, and there is always a possibility of its breakdown due to rapid social change, and that the breakdown of the family is inherently related to the breaking of the social cohesion or the moral order of society. Now, we're going to look specifically at one particular functionalist author's theorization of the family, and that is Talcott Parsons, who's an American sociologist, and he provides a detailed analysis of the nuclear family. Now, what he's really interested in is trying to understand the fit between nuclear family, which are these small size families, and the industrial society. Now, what he says is that in a nuclear family, it does away with the problem of economic differentiation, because in large families, it may so happen that one member is a wage earner and the other member is a manager. So this may create a kind of conflict of interest between the members of the family, which does not happen if you have a smaller family with only one earning member who is the breadwinner of the family. He also thinks that the nuclear family is suitable for a capitalist society because a smaller family means greater geographical and economic mobility. The family can move from one place to another in search of employment and better opportunities. So that also makes it a functional fit with industrial societies. Now, nuclear families have also an important role to actually resolve the value conflict that exists in industrial societies with the family. Now, industrial societies generally tend to value principles of universalism, individuality, achievement and merit, right? And families are spaces of ascriptive identities, of affectivity, of the value of collectivity and particularism. So, in this sense, what happens is that the segregation of the family and a smaller family from the rest of the society is a way in which this value conflict is also managed, right? And nuclear family, according to Talcott Parsons, then performs two important functions. One is, of course, as I've already mentioned, which is the function of primary socialization, where children are taught to become individuals who will function well in an industrial society. The second important function is adult personality stabilization, which is associated with tension management and emotional security that families provide to its adult members. Now, industrial work and generally living in industrial societies is seen to be stressful, and families are imagined as a safe haven for the stressed male worker. Now, of course, in these families there exists generally a clear-cut sexual division of labor, where it is the men who is seen as the breadwinner who goes out and work, and women are associated with affective roles of caring for the home, for children, and for the elderly within the family. Now, it's important to understand that this idea of the nuclear family that sort of the author tells us also has begun to function as a kind of ideology, which means that not only there is a fit between nuclear family and industrial society, but it also seems that nuclear family becomes a desirable model of the family. So there is a kind of pressure to nuclearize the family so that it suits the needs of sort of developed industrial modern societies. So this was the functionalist perspective. Functionalist perspective do not look at the issue of power and conflict and inequality within societies, and hence you have the conflict perspectives which try to focus on power and inequalities within families, and they show how families are actually a site for the reproduction of various forms of inequality, namely racial, class, and gender inequalities. Families reinforce inequalities to the extent that they transmit property, social status, and identity. Thus, class and racial and gender privileges can be acquired through families depending on, of course, the specific familial context. Now, Marxist perspective also focus on the relationship between family and capitalism, but they do it in a different way. They don't see it in terms of how it leads to social solidarity or is a functional fit, but they see how it actually is an unequal institution then, right? Now, what the nuclear family does is that it diverts the attention of the wage worker to family life. In doing so, he is able to ignore the enormous alienation that he faces in a factory site, right? And then does not sort of challenge the capitalist institution. Also, very importantly, the unpaid and domestic and reproductive labor of wives and mothers also serve capitalist interests. Now, how does that happen? Because generally what these women do at home is that they not only take care of the present generation, but through socialization of children, they actually produce the next generation of workers, which will go and work in these factories and help capitalists make their profits. So in that sense, the family helps in the perpetuation of capitalist societies. Women also constitute a very important reserve army of labor, which means that when there is an employment shortage or there is a wage rise, you can always employ women. Like, for instance, it happened during the Second World War, when men on account of conscription had to go to fight these wars, women took in their jobs in such a situation, so that the capitalist system does not get destabilized. Now, when women do enter these jobs, what happens is that they find themselves concentrated in part-time, contractual, lower-level feminine jobs with little social security benefits. Marxist feminists tend to explain this in terms of the continuous importance of the ideas of domesticity, which means that even when women go out and work, right, the family, the space of the home becomes it remains their most important responsibility. So taking care of the family remains the abiding sort of moral responsibility for women, even in industrial societies. Marxists have further argued that nuclear families tend to socialize children, as I've already discussed, and this socialization is a way of internalizing the spirit of capitalism, as it were, which means that they internalize obedience, respect, and authority, and also their gendered ideas. In time, what will happen is that these children will become the future workers and consumers that capitalism needs to thrive and survive. So in this sense, the family, the nuclear family, actually supports an unequal capitalist system. Very important perspective on the family is, of course, the feminist perspective, which tries to look at the family from the vantage point of the experience of women. And one of its most important critique is the critique of biologism that is inherent in families. So families are often seen as natural entities, and the gendered division of labor that exists within families, right? That men go out to work and women stay at home and sort of do the domestic chores. This is naturalized. So the idea is that what men and women are doing is naturally suitable to them. Their bodies are attuned to this because, women reproduce, hence they better stay at home, take care of children and others in the family. So for them, the family becomes a site of patriarchal domination. And the spatial distinction that exists in modern societies between, family as the private space and the work and political space as the public space, it actually increases gender inequality. Because in the public space, all social rewards are there, like money, power, mobility. And in the private space, which is seen as a largely feminized sphere, all the work that women do gets devalued, right? So this leads to a certain kind of gender inequality. Now, in families, men control women's bodies. They regulate their sexuality. They appropriate their labor, which also helps capitalist societies, as we have seen in the previous theory. It also restricts their mobility and defines and determines their life chances. So what happens is that, in some sense, what feminists point out is that the family is a kind of trap for women. Right? It curtails their freedom and their life chances and the possibility of their moral development and self-actualization. Radical feminists have highlighted the ways in which families oppress women by acknowledging that the personal is political. The idea that earlier whatever happened in families was seen to be a private matter. But it was feminists who pointed out that we should actually look at the experience of women in families as a very political issue, and hence they have called attention to the routine emotional, mental and physical abuse that women are subjected to in families. And the family is a site of violence, particularly violence against women and children, say for instance in the form of wife battery, marital rape, dowry deaths, child sexual abuse, female infanticide. These are all prominent forms of domestic violence against women that feminists have attempted to confront. Radical feminists also sort of try to point out that in the sort of family, heterosexual intercourse where women are expected to cater to men's sexual interests, that becomes institutionalized. So their sexual autonomy, their sexual fulfillment becomes a secondary matter. Also very importantly, modern families, nuclear families, they tend to institutionalize heterosexual monogamy, right? Which also means that this results in the discrimination against same-sex couples, right? Because we have this image that families are formed by a man, a biological man and a biological woman and their children, right? So this automatically sort of criminalizes non-heterosexual desire and alternate sexual lifestyle. So feminists also provide a critique to this. We are now going to try and look at families in an Indian context, and we're going to get into what has been famously referred to as the nuclear versus joint family debate. Now, a joint family system is a resource-sharing residential unit comprising of members of a unilineal descent group, often 3 generations, which live together with their spouses and offsprings. Now, it represents the core Indian values of familialism over individualism, and it is seen as integral to national self-imagination. Now, there has been a dominant discourse that with the modernization of Indian society, joint families are disintegrating. So the similar argument that I was trying to make, that with modern economic development, with industrialization, with urbanization, the family size starts reducing. So the argument is that modern industrialization have contributed to the breakdown of the joint family system in India. Now, however, this modernization thesis or this nuclearization thesis pertaining to India and the disintegration of the joint family, even Milton Singer has actually demonstrated the persistence of joint family both as a structure as well as a value system despite urbanization and industrialization. In fact, he has argued that joint family system actually has adapted to the changing sort of ethos of Indian modernization and can be a better a more competitive mechanism in Indian modern society. Now, in order to operationalize this debate, so that to really try and understand if empirically the family has been changing, scholars have, instead of using the 2 concepts of nuclear and joint, they have tried to create a new set of classifications of the concept of the household. Now, household refers to the commensal and the residential group, so members who eat together and live together basically. Now, here then they have reformulated the question. Rather than asking whether there is a transition from the joint family to the nuclear family, they ask the question, is the joint household disintegrating, right? And there are some sort of basic answers that scholars like Patricia Oberoi have tried to provide about the various trends in Indian family. Now, they argue that generally, in modern Indian society, nuclear families are more numerous, even though a majority of persons might still be residing in joint or nuclear supplemented families, that is, nuclear family members plus relatives and their spouses. They've also said the average size of the household has been increasing actually due to a range of factors such as population growth, increased longevity and greater life expectancy, housing problems, right? Because of the great expenditure on buying house, so families are becoming larger in size and staying in the same place. Norms of household formation and patrilocal residence. Patrilocality means that when women get married, they actually go and live with the sort of the the husband sides of the family. An absence of state welfare measures and lack of economic development, because India's welfare state is not a very powerful welfare state, and also there is uneven economic development in India, and this also affects the household size, and generally because of this the household size has been increasing. Households in India have developmental cycles, which means that they move through cycles of expansion, fission, which means breakdown, and replacement, which intersects with the life cycle of an individual. So a life cycle of individual is basically an individual growing up, studying, marrying, having children, and dying. So similarly, you can expect this individual to live in different kinds of household formations during their lifetime within Indian society. Now, a STEM family, that is parents residing with married children, is emerging as a significant pattern of family organization. It provides a mechanism for the care of the elderly in the absence of state welfare measures. Now, interestingly, rural households are comparatively larger in size than urban households, but this does not again mean that, it is sort of reinvigorating the debate that, with urbanization you have more nuclearization. Because what actually happens is sometimes when rural folks, they migrate for jobs in cities, for a time period, people from the same region, when they migrate, they may share household resources, right? In such a situation, some urban households can actually be larger in size than a nuclear unit. Also, it has been seen that the joint family is more numerous in North India than in South India, and this regional difference has been explained in terms of sort of property ownership, marriage practices, etc. Despite all of this, there is generalized commitment to joint family values in modern Indian society. So even if people are living in nuclear families, there is an intense interaction and maintenance of kinship tie between sort of relatives, and continuous kin obligations and bonds are maintained even by nuclear households. We are now going to try and look at some of the global trends in family forms and see how families have been changing in the global context. Now, one important aspect of this is that if earlier families were sort of put together on the basis of marriage, which were arranged by elders within the two groups that were arranging it, today you have the ideals of romantic love which have been entrenched in the West and which have, through the process of globalization, been carried to the rest of the world. And governments have also played a very important role in framing laws and policies which have led to changes in the family form in a global context. Anthony Giddens has identified some recent developments in the institution of the family. They include decline in the significance of kin groups and clans, which means no longer is kinship our most important aspect of identity. Because of urbanization, family becomes a private matter, and there are other aspects of the identity which become more important. Say, for instance, our identity as citizens. There is a movement towards free selection of spouses and a decline in arranged marriage, as I just pointed out. There is also, very importantly, a recognition of women's rights and their improved status within families. And this is particularly through the feminist intervention that I had been discussing, that, their status has changed because feminists have intervened and they have created a set of rules and regulations which actually protects women's rights within the family. There is also today greater sexual freedom and a growing acceptance of same-sex relationships and new forms of family that are formed by LGBT people, and of course the recognition of the rights of children as well. Some of the recent global trends in family can be summed up as, firstly, the family size is shrinking. Now, there are various reasons for it. Firstly, because married couples are choosing to have less children. And this is, of course, associated with, couples first choosing to marry at a later age. Increased longevity also means that the number of years spent in childbearing and child rearing constitute a smaller portion of a parent's life. And this has an impact on women particularly, because now they can think of having a working life, they can think of having careers. There is a decrease due to, of course, healthcare in infant mortality and maternal mortality rate. Fertility rate is, of course, on the decline. And young people are also choosing to marry at a later age. So all these factors have led to simply a shrinking in family size. There is, of course, a rise in divorce rates all across the globe, particularly in developed countries. And some of the reasons that have been provided are that because life expectancy has increased, it has elongated the marriage period. And so if earlier you had the termination of a marriage due to the death of a spouse, today sometimes it is untenable to continue a marriage, and hence marriages have been breaking down. Then, of course, today there are laws which are more accessible, which have shifted from an adversarial system, which means earlier you could only have a divorce with a particular reason, such as adultery or cruelty or desertion. But today you can have a no-fault divorce or a mutual divorce. So hence divorces are becoming common. Individualism is also on the rise. It is associated with modernism, and hence a greater investment is being placed in personal satisfaction. Hence less people are willing to remain in unhappy marriages. The changing status of women because of feminist intervention is also an important reason. Now women believe too that they do not have to be saddled with unhappy marriages, which really sort of ruins their lives. Instead, if they want out, if they want freedom, they can simply ask for a divorce. Educated women who are economically independent may end marriages knowing that they can support themselves. A belief that domestic violence and long-term conflict may be more harmful to children than divorce. So earlier the idea was that a couple stayed together because for them the children mattered, and the breakdown of the marriage could have had an adverse effect on the children. But there is a realization that actually watching parents fight day in and day out can be more harmful for a child's mental capacity. And the changes, of course, in the rates of divorce also means that there is more remarriages, which also means that there are new forms of families such as the step families and the reconstituted families, which have become more prevalent, particularly in Western societies. Another important aspect of globalization is, of course, the formation of transnational family structures. Now, what are transnational family structures? Now, these are structures which happen because of, these are families which are affected by international migration. So, when you have some people who have to leave a particular country to work in a separate country in order to sort of earn better for employment purposes. One parent or both may find employment and live in one country, whereas his or her spouse and children reside in the country of origin. Now, for instance, migrant women who provide domestic services on multi-year contracts managed by the government, their remittances are brought back home to support their own family. So this is very common. Men especially go out and work in different countries. Say, for instance, in India, particularly in South India, you see there are a lot of men who go and work in Gulf countries and they remit money. So often the families in India, then they have more women and men are working outside. So this creates a kind of transnational families, and they have their own unique challenges to manage familial relationships across different nations. Another important trend is, of course, the legal recognition of same-sex marriages. So there is a growing acceptance of gay and lesbian marriages among younger people, and gay and lesbian marriages are believed to be more flexible and egalitarian, especially among lesbian couples, because the idea is that they are not fixed. There are no fixed standards or universal roles that are imagined as it is for the heterosexual nuclear family. So this is seen as a space of creativity and negotiation of power. But same-sex parenting is of course a complex issue. Now, while there are many states who have granted marriage rights, they still have not granted rights of adoption, and yet you have same-sex couples who may have children from previous heterosexual marriages or by adoption or through use of reproductive technologies. Now, there is generally a kind of controversy around, how effective is raising of children by gay and lesbian families, but studies have shown that the outcome of children raised in same-sex household is very similar to heterosexual households, although such children remain vulnerable to homophobic violence in schools, etc. So the problem is not so much with homosexual families, the problem is actually with a society which is generally homophobic. But of course these ideas are changing, and you do have positive images of homosexual parents and homosexual couples. There is also, very importantly, through feminist intervention, a growing recognition of domestic violence within families. Much of the violence within families was unnoticed earlier because it was seen that family is a private unit. So it was for the feminist who had to say that the personal is political, that's when domestic violence was noticed. There is today a growing literature on domestic abuse. Domestic abuse may be physical, mental or emotional. Child abuse also is very prevalent within families, particularly child sexual abuse and incest, as well as the abuse of elders within families whose social roles may have waned, and hence they are seen as burden by the younger members of the family. Institutions such as the media and law are playing a very important role in actually demystifying this idea that the family is a safe haven, that it's a great place, it takes care of you. But it also is trying to highlight how families can harm you, can create physical and mental problems and challenges for its members. With this, I would like to conclude the discussion to say that families remain a very important institution, but they have been changing for two major reasons. One is, of course, state interventions and as well as feminist intervention, so that families are becoming more and more egalitarian, and the issue of inequality within families is becoming a major issue, and both inequality and violence is being addressed in today's times. Thank you.